We want to give you the ability to recognize some inaccuracies that typically happen in Portfolio Manager with benchmarking, and we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to just talk about the steps on how to improve your Energy Star score. And then one thing that I really think this has done is with the EPA and the DOE changing the Portfolio Manager algorithms and utilizing more recent CBEX data. I think this is a wake-up call for every building owner out there or manager that you can't just relax when you're doing Energy Star. You always got to be thinking about continuous improvement. And when they make an adjustment like they did, it definitely forces all of us to take another look at how the energy is going within, how we're using energy in the building. And if anything, this is a correction that's going to force people to dive in. And I can tell you what we have done is we've done a lot of work to hit some buildings that have huge drops in their scores, and we were able to get them back pretty quickly just by really focusing in on things that were a little harder to do. And I'm going to talk about that today in this presentation as well. And just a quick note about me. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tad Radzinski. I'm the president and co-founder of Sustainable Solutions Corporation. We started the company back in 2001, and our primary focus in 2001 was really working on buildings. And I'm excited to be talking about this today. This is something that I teach at Villanova University. We have a master's degree in sustainable engineering that I teach in, and I teach a sustainable buildings and operations class. And I have all my students learn how to use Portfolio Manager. In fact, they get assigned a project. We typically do some buildings on the campus, and we even do energy audits with that. For those of you that don't know about Sustainable Solutions, I'll just give a quick background on us. We focus in on not only sustainable buildings and operations, like I just mentioned, where we're doing energy audits, energy modeling, Energy Star Manager, LEED certification, National Green Building Standard, but we do a lot with corporate sustainability. We have a lot of companies that we work for that we help them integrate and implement their overall sustainability objectives. We basically support them in meeting their sustainability goals, writing sustainability reports, doing materiality assessments, and doing things like life cycle assessment and helping them optimize their products. We also do a ton of work in manufacturing plants, and that's one of our sweet spots. So along with just standard buildings like office buildings, we're very comfortable working in manufacturing as well. And being that you're all on this webinar, training and education is also something we do. We do at least 4 webinars a year, as well as we just hosted an Operation Zero Waste Summit that we invited quite a few people to learn how they can do different things. So these are things that we do here. So we're going to talk a lot today about energy efficiency, and really what we are trying to do with energy efficiency is just reduce the amount of energy being used in a building, and really taking a hard look at how we can do that. Not only does that reduce the cost of the operation, but it's going to definitely reduce the environmental impact. When I first started my engineering career, I worked for Philadelphia Electric, and I spent 12 years working for them as a designer, draftsman, all the way up through system engineer at a nuclear plant. And I can tell you, the way we make electricity in this country is very impactful. And anything we can do to reduce the amount of kilowatt hours or even the fossil fuels we use in a building are going to be really helpful, because it's going to save us a lot of money, but it's also going to reduce the impacts associated with that. I mean, think about it. If you're getting your electricity from a plant that burns coal or oil or even natural gas, there's impacts of extracting those fuels. And then power plants are very inefficient. Most power plants only run at 30% efficiency. So every time you're, basically burning, coal or natural gas or other fuels to make electrons, only 30% of that fuel value actually generates the electrons that come out of the plant. Then if we factor in line losses over the grid, we're down to about 27% of the energy that went in comes into our buildings. And that's why when you look at Portfolio Manager, you're going to see that you're going to have the site energy and the source energy as the different kBq per square foot things you're going to see. We also know that it's really important to improve building performance, and it's often people will ask, well, where do I even begin? And the first thing we always want to do is benchmark. And for those of you that are on the call today that actually have buildings that can be benchmarked, which I'll talk about in a minute, we want to measure exactly where you are, and we want to keep doing that on a continuous basis. So once we understand that, that allows us to make adjustments in our operations, in our building automation system, maybe with our lighting. I'm going to tell you today that a lot of things I'm going to talk about don't require capital. If you're really designing and using your system smartly and maximizing the use of a BAS, you can definitely save energy and reduce your cost for very little cost to yourself. And the one thing that we like to look at is making sure that the utility bills are entered properly, understanding what is the actual energy being consumed per square foot of building. One thing we find is we work in a lot of buildings that are, multi-tenant, as well as, for corporations that have maybe their, corporate headquarters and things like that. But in a multi-tenant building, the number of occupants can vary year to year depending on if leases expire and people don't renew, or if you have new tenants coming in. So it's really important to have a good handle on what's going on in the building, how many people are in there, how many computers, and all that kind of thing to really get a good understanding of the kBTUs per square foot that are being utilized that ultimately drives the Energy Star score. And we do know that once we benchmark, it allows us to make sure we can do the right things in the building. And the big negative that I see with benchmarking, that the one thing that Energy Star Portfolio Manager does not do, is it doesn't really give us the pie chart that we need to understand of, all right, I bring in a lot of electricity and natural gas into my building. How is that being utilized? Natural gas is a little easier because we know it's either going to be in, probably heating of the building, or maybe a boiler, or maybe it's used in cooking or something like that. So that piece is easy. But when we get into electricity, there's a lot of uses of electricity. So trying to understand, how much went to HVAC, how much went to lighting, how much went to plug loads, ventilation, et cetera. All those things are important. And that's one thing that our electric utility meter does not tell us. It's another thing that Portfolio Manager doesn't tell us when we do this. So being able to create that pie chart is going to be a really important part of how you look at the energy being used in the building. And we do know, I'll talk about it in a minute, that there are laws that require buildings to report this information to Portfolio Manager. Right in Philadelphia, they have the energy disclosure requirements and benchmarking requirements. And that's really made a lot of changes with different building owners having to take a look at what's going on, and then having maybe potential tenants asking, why is your score so low? Maybe I'm not going to move in here. So driving a little competition among the building owners. So Energy Star, for those of you that may not be familiar, it's actually a partnership program that was developed with the Department of Energy and the United States Environmental Protection Agency. I worked at the EPA for 10 years. I was not affiliated with Energy Star. However, that was one of our voluntary program partners that I worked with. I actually worked to focus on reducing waste in buildings and operations. So that was my role as the Waste Minimization National Expert, but I did work very closely with the Energy Star team. And Energy Star is a great program. I mean, it gives you the ability to benchmark your buildings. It also helps us identify products and appliances and different things that we buy in our buildings that actually are more efficient, that we can utilize to drive down our power. And what you have to do if you're not familiar with this is you basically are going to take all the information about a building and create what we call a portfolio manager for your building. And Energy Star Portfolio Manager is the official name of the software we use. My Portfolio allows you to set up the building. And what you want to look at is, all right, where are you on a scale of 1 to 100 of being rated for your building? And anything with a 75 or higher score is considered could be Energy Star certified. I want to point out, though, that you can't just achieve a 75 and do Energy Star certification. You do need a professional engineer to review this statement of energy performance. You also need that professional engineer to verify that you are meeting minimum requirements for the building, like ventilation for the occupants, proper lighting, etc., comfort, thermal comfort, all of those different things. Because the way this is written, they don't want building owners to be closing off their outside air and turning the thermostat so high or low that people are totally uncomfortable and then not providing any lighting just to get good scores. You still have to do this in balance with, the requirements of the occupants and meeting those indoor air standards and whatnot. These are the type of buildings that are eligible for Energy Star rating through the Portfolio Manager program. Hospitals, schools, multifamily housing, senior care, office buildings, courthouses, etc. But you'll notice on here, there's really nothing in here for manufacturing. So if any of you are on here from a manufacturing facility, Portfolio Manager can be used to benchmark the building, but it's not actually going to give you a rating to say, all right, you have a rating of a 65 or a 75. The algorithm doesn't allow that, but it will give you the KBTU per square foot, which you could actually use to analyze these different things. So one thing that we really want to talk about, the main thrust of this is last year, EPA and DOE made some changes to the Portfolio Manager program where they basically changed the data that was being used. And what had happened was EPA and DOE, as they updated Portfolio Manager, were supposed to be doing this on a regular basis. And because of some problems with the ability to get data, there was some kind of delay or something, that the plan was they use what's called CBEX data, and that's commercial building information that looks at hundreds, if not tens of thousands of buildings, collects energy information off of them, and basically gives you a snapshot of how certain building types should perform. So like the slide I just showed you with all these different building types, the information on these is basically if I'm putting in there, say, information for a office building or even a data center, I'm not being compared to, say, a school. When I run my Portfolio Manager, that algorithms built into that software is going to compare that building to other similar retail stores or data centers or office buildings, and you're not mixing building types. And that's what the CBEX data does. The thing is, the CBEX data gets updated periodically and then gets integrated into the Portfolio Manager. And what happened was last year, they did not, they brought in data that was a vintage way longer than expected. For example, they should have been updating Portfolio Manager every 4 to 6 years, and I think the delay was almost 9 years before they updated the data, something like that, which then affected the overall scores for every building because a lot newer data was coming in. Think about it, if you're bringing in data from much newer buildings that are built to a tighter energy code, their performance is obviously going to be better in that particular category than buildings that were built in the 80s or even the 90s or the early 2000s. Because we're seeing all over the country that ASHRAE 90.1 2013, IECC 2015 are all being utilized for different areas, which basically has really raised the bar on energy performance in new buildings. So as these new buildings come online, the CBEX data, the actual building performance gets better in these buildings, which means for older buildings that aren't meeting the same code, their energy performance is not going to be as good. And that's one of the reasons the scores went down. So what we have found is that EPA realized that there was a significant drop by just about everybody. I can tell you, we probably benchmark in Energy Star at least 50 buildings a year, and we saw every single one of them drop anywhere from probably 8 points down to as high as 22 or 24 points in their Energy Star rating. So that was a big hit because think about it, we had buildings that were just barely 75, maybe 76, and suddenly we're down back into the 40 or the 50s or 60s. We had buildings that were in the 90s and the 80s that were then barely Energy Star. So this really had a big effect. And what happened was the EPA, after they started really looking at this and determining what the effect was, they realized that they had done something. They basically removed from different climate zones the heating degree days to and some of the cooling degree days as far as how they ran the algorithm. And I think their logic was, because the climate is changing, there's going to be more cooling degree days than there is going to be heating degree days in certain climate zones as the climate shifts. So perhaps they're not really giving any credit for heating degree days. And they ended up figuring out that that was a mistake. And what a heating degree day or a cooling degree day is basically based on average daily temperatures that differ from a norm of 65 degrees. So, there's 365 days in a year, but you know, it depends on how many hours and all these different things. So, for example, Chicago has 6,683 heating degree days and only 1,000 cooling degree days. And again, this is a little confusing because it's not exactly days; it's based on hours and whatnot. And that has a big effect on how a building uses energy. Like for an example, a building in Chicago is going to need more heat than cooling, which is evidenced by this slide right here. So if the portfolio manager in warmer climates didn't give any credit for heating degree days, that would definitely have an adverse impact on the overall score of the building. So that is something that happened. We did learn that, there was a lot of variability in different locations, and the heating degree days are being entered back into Portfolio Manager now. In fact, the revised models were released on July 22nd, and you're going to be able to recertify for office buildings. At least you'll be able to start certification again on July 31st. And what they did is they looked at for all the different types of buildings that had heating degree days of at least 944 heating degree days. Those were brought back in. For anything with less than that many, those scores probably won't change because they didn't really make any adjustment there. So again, this is just, I'm not going to go through this calculation method here, but this just basically shows how the heating degree day adjustment was integrated into Portfolio Manager, which has had an increase and an improvement in the scores, as you can see here. We basically had seen that, when they revised the model, if you look here in the scores from the August 18th model to the revised scores with the heating degree day adjustment, it actually did improve some of the scores here. In fact, we looked at our portfolio buildings that we certify, and we have seen anywhere from a average of 4.3 points coming back into the score. Like, so if I was a 65, my building would now be a 69, as high as I think 14 points gained in some buildings that we have done in different areas, again, based on their heating and whatnot. So the good news is that the heating degree day adjustment is going to improve your scores without you having to really do anything in your buildings. However, I'm still going to strongly encourage everybody here to continue to do their due diligence, making sure the portfolio manager is updated, continue to do energy audits and that kind of thing to improve the scores, because it's not going to cut off the average of 12 to 20 points that everybody lost. You're still going to be well below where you were even with this heating degree day adjustment back in. And you can see here, this is just what some of the effect will be for buildings with less than 4,000 heating degree days. They're definitely going to see a smaller point increase. Like, for example, August 2018 office model was a 55. With the revised model with the adjusted heating degree days, it went up three points in the rating. Whereas you see a bigger jump for higher heating degree days, where 52 was the score for buildings in the range of 4,000 to 8,000. They picked up about 6 rating points. Then for any buildings that were over 8,000 heating degree days, they picked up, roughly 11 points there in their rating score. So anyway, this is definitely good news. Going to definitely affect how things go. But again, I don't think we should rest at all, because this is just a wake-up call to keep doing continuous improvement. I do want to talk a minute about the energy disclosure requirements that are out there. This map basically shows all the different areas in the United States that have energy disclosure or require benchmarking. You can see here that there's definitely one of these markers here for Philadelphia. New York City requires it. Boston, Washington D.C. Now we have Washington and Oregon, and even the state of Texas is requiring energy benchmarking in many areas. There's some locations in Florida. So there's cities, there's whole states that are requiring this. And what this is doing is it's forcing anybody that owns a building, typically over 50,000 square feet or 25,000 square feet, to have to go in and enter their information into Portfolio Manager, submit that to your city or state, and that data then gets aggregated and is usually put into a public database that people can access and see, and then they can start to ask questions about why is the performance not so good. So we also see that in many areas that if you don't do it, like if you decide not to integrate this data and submit to your city or state, you're going to have a situation where they'll probably start to fine you. I know in Philadelphia, for folks that did not submit by the end of June to the city of Philadelphia, they are subject to $100 a day for fines for not doing it, and that does get enforced. So if you're on this call right now and you're in one of these locations that does require it, you better verify to see if there's any penalties by not doing it. And if you haven't done it, you better get it done, because you are subject to sometimes fines or other penalties for not submitting the data, because it is technically a law. And just about every one of these utilizes the Energy Star Portfolio Manager program as that means of benchmarking. So different other reasons besides improving your scores, not only to meet those requirements of the energy benchmarking laws or disclosure laws, but it is definitely for Energy Star certification. I strongly encourage anybody that owns a building or manages a building to consider doing Energy Star certification. It's a low-cost way to basically show, either your customers or your employees or potential tenants that you are committed to doing things in an energy efficient manner, reducing your impacts, doing things sustainably. It's a great way to get that done. It's also great for attracting and retaining tenants and marketing. We train a lot of the building owners and facility managers to be speaking about this, when they're talking to potential tenants or even occupants, just to demonstrate that they have, really been done doing some good work around reducing costs. Operating costs in the building is the #1 driver. Also, I know that the General Services Administration, their contracts require any new leases, the building must be Energy Star certified. And then, definitely to reduce your costs. I mean, it's a huge, huge reason to do this. So let's talk a little bit about some things we can do to improve your Energy Star score. And the first thing I'm going to recommend is really making sure you got Portfolio Manager set up right. We've done in the last 2 months about a dozen energy audits, and we always start out with this. A lot of the buildings are ones that we've been benchmarking anyway. However, we are really zeroing in and making sure that things are set up right. These are some of the big things that we see when it comes to Energy Star benchmarking: making sure that you're using gross floor area of the facility and not rentable area, making sure you're including your parking on the main electric meter if it is actually metered on that. Sometimes there's buildings that are going to have separate, like outdoor lighting and surface parking, and a lot of times that gets overlooked, and that is still sucking the electrons to light the parking lot. Another one would be making sure you're getting all the server rooms and data centers in. There are very specific requirements on what defines a server room, and you need to make sure that it does have like a UPS. It is, dedicated to a certain number of server racks and whatnot. But think about it. If you think about operations in your building, let's just say it's a standard office building, a lot of times you're using your building automation system to back off or go into night setbacks or weekend setbacks where there's no occupants, but a server room never stops running. And the same thing with parking lot lighting. Even if the building's not occupied, you're going to have the lights coming on for the parking lots in case somebody's there at night or for security purposes. So this is why we want to make sure we're capturing everything that uses energy And the thing you have to really think about is those do not run on the same schedule as your employees or your tenants of your building. So a server room is going to run uh, 8,760 hours a year. It never shuts off. Your server's always running. Your cooling system's always running. Same thing with parking lot lights. They're always going to come on around, obviously hoping they're only coming on when it's dark, by using photo sensors. But those things are really important to capture, and this is a common thing we see that is missed in many portfolio managers. Another thing we're going to recommend is making sure you're updating your inputs on a regular basis. You have to be really looking at what's going on in the building. For example, if you have change in occupancy, there's a lot less people or more people, or there's a lot more computers or less computers. All of those are going to have an effect. We recommend at least annually doing a survey to find out how many people are in the building, how many computers, getting that head count, because that's a huge part of what drives the algorithm in the portfolio manager. You want to make sure your energy meters and the units are correct, and you're checking those on a regular basis. And then just doing data quality checks. That's a tool that exists in Portfolio Manager that allows you to do that. So, like I said, when it comes to checking existing information, a lot of times we find that data is input wrong. Maybe there's a missing month, or there's a situation where somebody mistyped the data in. If you mix up some numbers here, let's say that this top number for gas usage here in CCF was actually really 1,834, and somebody transposed the numbers. You're showing that that's over 500 less CCF that were used. That happens a lot. You got to double check and make sure that the data is accurate and that kind of thing. And then once you have that portfolio manager fully updated, that's the time to say, okay, now we have a good feeling. We're confident that our score we're getting out of this is correct. And then we know what our baseline is. So even with the drop in portfolio manager scores, I can tell you that people were cruising along. If you were Energy Star, or you had a nice score, you probably were not as cognizant to really zoom in on your portfolio manager. You're probably resting and saying, all right, we're Energy Star anyway, not to worry. We have helped a lot of companies by really zeroing in on that portfolio manager for years. We have a couple buildings in Philadelphia that they had set up their own portfolio managers, and when we came in, there was a lot of errors, a lot of things missing, a lot of things not calculated properly, not set up right. Once we fixed that, we gained a few points just from fixing their portfolio manager and getting that up to date. So I can't emphasize enough how important that is. Another thing is to run this data quality check tool in Portfolio Manager. Really easy to do. It's a checkbox in here, and what you'll do is get some alerts when they find something that's wrong. So I do encourage you to definitely look at that. Here's an example where there was an IT energy verification required for a particular building. And again, just a really important thing to make sure you're using the software to the max to do the best you can. So now let's talk about how we're going to jack up the score. We fixed our portfolio manager. Everything's set up right. We've got some really good stuff going on, and we know the score is really accurate because our parking lots are connected. We've got all the IT and data centers are properly in there. We just updated the number of people and computers, and we verified that our utility data is put in correctly. And maybe the score went up, maybe it went down, but now we know where we are. So then what we're going to do is we're going to do an energy audit. And I recommend doing these energy audits every 3 to 5 years because technology changes, things in the building change, things break down. Another big change that always occurs in a building is usually your engineering staff. A lot of times you get a really good engineer, and then they end up leaving. Maybe they go to another building, or maybe they retire or decide they don't want to work anymore, whatever it is, and you lose them. But they had really good knowledge on how to use the building automation system, or how to control lighting and things like that, and you lose that knowledge, and then suddenly your score goes up or down, because your energy consumption goes through the roof because things aren't being managed properly. So very important to do these energy audits, and we always zoom in on #1 thing that we want to do is turn things off. Most effective ECM you could ever do. And typically what we do with that is we're going to take a really hard look inside the building automation system. I'm assuming that many of you on this call and webinar today are in buildings that might have a BAS or, you know, energy management system. You can call it all kinds of different things, but really it's that computer that somebody in the building is utilizing to run the equipment. So maybe there's chillers in your building, maybe there's air handlers, VAVs, exhaust fans, outside air. Any of that stuff is going to be typically monitored. Even your cooling towers are typically managed in the building automation system. And my number one thing is if there's no people in the building and we don't need to be cooling or heating, we either set it back or we turn it off. And you will be surprised how many buildings we go into that this is not set up properly. Out of the 10 or 12 energy audits that we just did over the last few months, I can tell you that 80% of them had issues with the BAS not being set up properly. So very important aspect to think about. Definitely lighting, that's another one. I have building owners and facility managers all the time saying, we turn off our lights every night when everybody leaves. We make sure that our parking lot lights aren't on in the day. And we do these audits and we find out all the time that the lights are always left on. In many cases, you know, maybe the BAS was overridden, maybe there is no BAS, and you're relying on your cleaning staff to shut the lights off in the evenings when they're leaving. Every one of these has an effect. Just look at it. When you're driving around at night, look at how many office buildings are fully lit and you know nobody's there. The parking lot's empty. So that's an example of how this works. Another thing that we would want to be looking at is implementing the lowest cost measures. So by optimizing the building operating schedule, you know, phasing in lighting replacements, doing different things like that, all of these things are going to basically give you that low-hanging fruit that you really want to do to optimize your schedule. And if we think about it, you know, when I'm looking in the BAS, I can tell you that 9 times out of 10, in fact, we were just at a building down in North Carolina, and their whole office area is set up, and it's occupied 60 hours a week out of 168 hours. And we found out that they do not use any of the setbacks for nighttime or, you know, weekend setbacks. So essentially, they're heating and cooling the entire building for 24/7, and there's only people in the building at, you know, 60 hours out of 168. So 108 hours, they're basically doing that. This is the easiest thing you could ever do. Another thing you could do is even jack up your, if you want to do setbacks or even trying to raise or lower temperatures is a really good thing to do with your BAS, and I would recommend that for all of you. Also, maybe you can put in timers to shut things off, looking at the set points in the building. Another big thing here with, you know, scheduling is just making sure if people do need overtime in the building, making sure that they have a methodology to request that overtime from you and get that information. Another thing that we want to be looking at is, you know, maybe upgrading lighting. This is an area that in the age now that we're in with LEDs, so much opportunity to really improve your lighting performance and different things like that. I can tell you these are our standard lighting recommendations. You want to put in the highest efficiency bulbs you can get. Typically what we would recommend if you're going to stick with, say, fluorescent tubes like T8s, instead of using 32 watts, you can now get 25 watts that create the same light efficacy and output as a 32 watt. And anybody that owns a building is going to be replacing the lamps anyway as they burn out if you stick with you know, T8 fluorescents. So why not just delamp or relamp to a lower wattage? Essentially what I'm showing you here is for every bulb you put in that goes from 32 to 25 is going to save you 7 watts. Another one would be any kind of accent decorative or exterior lights going to LED. Definitely a important move. Incandescent exit signs being replaced with LEDs. The nice thing is the LED technology compared to even 2 years ago is way more advanced now. We're able to really utilize that information and you know, get those LED lights and integrate them in. There's also rebates for a lot of them. And then I'm going to strongly recommend utilizing occupancy and daylight sensors where applicable. This image right here is actually a large, high lobby that's in an office building. A lot of daylight pouring into this building, but the lights stay on around the whole perimeter. So by integrating in some daylight sensors, basically the daylight sensors would then turn off the lights on the perimeter of this, atrium and save some money right off the bat. Obviously, there's a capital expenditure for any kind of lighting upgrades. Typically, what we find is lighting upgrades are going to be a 2-year payback at least, depending on what incentives are available. However, the other thing you really need to factor in, especially if you're getting out of fluorescent lamps and you're moving to LEDs, is you're going to be basically reducing your maintenance costs as well. Because think about it, LED is going to last up to 50,000 hours, whereas incandescent only lasts about 8,000 hours, and your T8s or T5s are going to maybe last 20,000 hours. So your replacement is a lot less, so that your maintenance costs go down, and it's something to factor in when you're doing these analysis. Another thing that I'm going to strongly recommend that everybody do as a low-cost thing, you want to go out and look at the flow rates on all your faucets. If you have faucets that are running at 2.2 gallons per minute, which is the norm, and you can switch to a 1 gallon per minute faucet or a 0.5 gallon per minute faucet, which will look like a shower spray, you're not only going to save water, but you're going to save energy to heat the water. Because think about it, when people are washing their hands after using the restroom, they're essentially using hot water. And there's a cost to heat that hot water that goes into this. So that is something that I would recommend here. And you can do this on the restrooms or lavatory faucets, kitchen faucets, and showers. If any of your buildings have showers, you want to consider going from a 2.5 down to a 1.75 gallon per minute shower head, because you're going to have not only the water savings, but a resulting savings in hot water, which is going to reduce energy costs in the building. Another thing is incentives. These are some of the programs that we're affiliated with: Smart Ideas and PICO, New Jersey's Pay for Performance program. District of Columbia has their Sustainable Energy Utility. PGW has Energy Sense. And then you can get rebates back for some of this. If you're smart and you're going to want to do like a lighting upgrade, for example, you can see in this table here, you basically can capture some money back for every bulb you change. You can see here, LED pin and screw-based lighting. If you go to Energy Star directional par 20s, they're going to give you $5 a bulb. And that's nice offset there, because we do see that these LED bulbs do cost more than your standard bulbs like a CFL or even an incandescent. In fact, incandescents you can't even get in a lot of locations because they're no longer allowed to be utilized. You're going to pay more money for the LEDs. So getting these rebates is really important. And these rebates you can get back on many things. It just doesn't have to be lighting. You can get it back for sometimes whole system replacements, adding variable frequency drives to motors, maybe improved building automation controls, demand control ventilation sometimes. That's another big area that I would strongly recommend. Even if you've done all your low-hanging fruit, you might need to go to things like looking at doing demand control ventilation, which is basically putting CO2 sensors in a building. And as the building gets occupied, the more people that come in, the more CO2 they basically as we breathe, we're, giving off CO2. And as that builds up, it gets sensed, and then outside air is brought in to give us good indoor air quality. So we want to make sure we're doing that only when people are there. And we've done demand control ventilation in a couple buildings down in Washington, D.C. with great results. Circling back to the lighting one more time, I'll just tell one other story. I remember working on a building about 2 years ago, and they had this really nice lobby that looked great. There was all this wood paneling, and it was beautiful. And they had about 200 spotlights that were basically shining down on the perimeter of the lobby on the wood, just to kind of accent the wood. When we got there, they were all halogen bulbs. So not only were they using like 150 watts per bulb, but they were also creating like this giant oven effect where you had almost 200 of these bulbs giving off a ton of heat. And basically, jacking up the cooling requirements for the space and just the lighting loads. So all we did is switch those bulbs to LEDs, cut down the temperature quite a bit compared to the halogens, and then it reduced the electricity consumption by like 75%. So just by that, we gained almost a 2% decrease in the energy consumption in the building. And that was a gigantic building. So looking for things like that is going to be really important to find those things. Another area that's often overlooked is stairwells. For those of you that have really dug in and done a lot of these things, you're going to want to really be thinking about where else can we find these opportunities. Another good one is occupant engagement. This is where a lot of people don't really get their employees or the tenants involved. A lot of companies will do Earth Day events where they're going to celebrate Earth Day, and it's a great time to be telling the people that are in the building about what the energy performance is like, educating them about things they could be doing at their desks to save energy, like maybe shutting off their computers at night, or making sure the power sleep mode is put on for their computers, not leaving things plugged in, keeping all kinds of different things managed in the right way. And then some buildings are even at the point now where we're working with them that they can have good sub-metering and they can actually measure performance by floor, and they're establishing competitions. I know at Villanova University, we've done an energy challenge and a waste challenge at the university. But these are things you can do in your buildings to get the occupants really engaged, sharing accomplishments. And a lot of times what we'll do is training and education, for different folks. You can see here, we have this example of this energy use memo that one of our buildings folks were sending out just to show how performance was going, getting it out to the occupants in the green teams in the building and things like that. So a lot of things you can do around occupant engagement. The one thing is we can design buildings and systems to be really efficient, but if the building engineer or the people sitting at their desks are not doing the things, leaving lights on, leaving task lights on, all these things start to add up and really affect our overall energy performance. Another thing I'd be looking at is trying to really get to the point where you get that Energy Star certification. We have many buildings that we do Energy Star certification on, and you do need to have a licensed professional engineer that applies their stamp. I'm a PE, so I probably seal at least 30 SEPs every year, just demonstrating that the building is Energy Star. That is also combined with our review of the building to make sure that they're doing everything right when it comes to energy savings and meeting indoor air quality, that there's plenty of outside air to meet ASHRAE standards, there's enough lighting that people are able to see and they're comfortable. All those things have to be validated by the professional engineer. And you want to make sure that you're using someone that's got high integrity and is legitimate about that. Then you submit for certification, and then you'll be awarded the Energy Star certification. Then you can basically obtain plaques and stickers for your building to let people know. And then I would highly recommend that if you are Energy Star certified, that you're going to promote that in your sustainability reports, promote it to your tenants and your employees, to your customers, that kind of thing, and use it to drive continuous improvement. So let's just do a quick summary here. We talked a lot about what Energy Star is, how it works, why there was major changes to the scores from last year, how the new updates with the heating degree days are going to help get those scores back up. But that's not all you need to do. I'm going to strongly encourage every one of us on this call to make sure you're definitely doing your continuous improvement and benchmarking. And I would highly recommend you do these energy audits, get somebody out that knows what they're doing to really dive in. And then once you have that energy audit done, you can actually use that for your capital planning. Like if you're going to need to put in some new equipment, or maybe you don't have the right staff to run the building automation system. Maybe it's worth the investment to get some training for your engineers that are running the building, because a lot of them are going to be really good at answering cold and hot calls because they don't want to be bothered by people complaining that they're too too cold or too hot. So the guys get really good at knowing how to adjust things to make them comfortable, but a lot of times they're not trained in all the horsepower that's in the BAS, like looking at things like, not only setbacks and scheduling, but trying to do outdoor temperature resets or supplier temperature resets. These are all things that we as professional engineers really dive into and give you these recommendations. We just did a couple office buildings over in uh, near our office here in the Philadelphia area, and we found out that there was a lot of issues in their BAS. Things weren't calibrated in years. They had economizers on there, and the economizers have to depend on what the outdoor air temperature is to basically run properly. And we found out that the outdoor air temperature gauge was off. It was never calibrated. It was off by like 20 degrees. So there were times that the economizer could have been running at full bore, but because that temperature sensors and thermometers weren't properly calibrated, there was issues. So those are the kind of things you want to do, get into the real nitty-gritty details. And I can pretty much guarantee that if you need help on any of this, we can guarantee we're going to help you get your score up. We're going to help you save money, and we're going to help you reduce your energy consumption. And we did talk a lot about, how to, reduce your operating expenses. I gave you a lot of tips on this call. So it looks like we're down to about 8 minutes left before the end of the call. And at this time, I'd like to take any questions that are out there. Happy to answer your questions. And it looks like I do have one that has come in. This person was asking about, you know, how to handle the portfolio manager updates that I talk about. Do you typically recommend that being done in-house, or do you want to have someone outside do it? I think it's going to be up to you as the building owner or manager. If you are going to be doing portfolio manager updates, you got to look at how much time does your staff have to make sure they're going in and doing it. How well trained are they? Typically, when we do these Energy Star updates and submissions for like areas that require energy disclosure, or for buildings that want to be Energy Star certified, we typically charge around $2,500 a year to do that. So for us to do that, you got to weigh that out. Is that worth it to have somebody in your staff do it? May not be doing it right. You could be actually having a higher score. You could be getting more credit. You could be basically attracting more tenants by, different things like that. So to me, it's a small investment. And then that includes if your building is certifiable, we're going to put the PE stamp on there, get your building certified. So again, I think you have to really consider what you want to do there. Another question that I have here is why, do you, with an energy audit, how in depth does it have to be? Well, there's different requirements and guidelines when you do energy audits. There's what we call ASHRAE level 1s and ASHRAE level 2s. An ASHRAE level 1 is going to be definitely the benchmarking and then and a walkthrough and initial analysis. Typically, any energy audit, what you want to be doing is understanding and updating the benchmarking. You want to be definitely grabbing information about, the different opportunities, what we call them energy conservation measures, figuring out how you're going to turn things off when you can, and then running the calculations on that to determine, what is the payback. I can tell you that anything done in the BAS, if it's only a programming change and you have someone who knows how to do it, whether you're contracting with someone to run your BAS or you have building engineers that do it, it is the lowest cost thing you could do, and it can provide tremendous savings. We've identified opportunities most recently in buildings to save anywhere from $5,000 just from BAS changes up to $300,000 to $400,000 a year just by adjusting things within the BAS. So that's a huge one. When you're looking at the lighting calculations, you really want to be making sure you're maximizing your use of rebates and different things like that. You also want to be looking at the fact that you don't want to be overlighting. A lot of times people just hire a electrician to come in and replace their lamps and lights. Not a good recommendation. Those guys are just going to come in, they're going to basically replace what was already there with a different style or type. What you want to do is a full-blown understanding of the lighting in the building, have things changed? What have you been able to do when it comes to like reducing lighting? Think about it now. Almost every office building uses tons of computers, and you don't need the lighting that we used to. It's not like you're in a surgery center or assembling fine parts. You want to make sure the foot candles are right, the spacing is right. It drives me crazy when I go into plants and they're like, "Oh yeah, we just did an LED retrofit." Oh, great. So you changed your light bulbs from your standard, uh, uh, metal halide to just lamps, or you went from, T5s to LEDs, but you didn't do a study, and now you are actually using more energy because you overlit the place so bad. That's the kind of thing that happens if you don't really dive into this right. And it's really, really critical. And then when we're working in manufacturing facilities, we're looking at really complex systems like air compressors and steam systems and things like that, all really important to consider. It looks like I have one more question. Somebody just wanted clarification about when these updates are going to be done. I want to be clear that the updates have been made. They happened on July 22nd, where they changed the heating degree days and brought that back in for a lot of areas, which has improved scores somewhat. And then anybody that's looking to do certification, that opens up again on July 31st, where you can actually submit your documentation to the EPA and DoD for your certification. So that's all the questions I have. I'm going to wrap it up. We have about 3 minutes left. I do want to say that we do have a couple webinars coming up for any of you that are interested. We're going to be talking about embodied carbon and how to reduce carbon in products and buildings. This is a really hot topic, especially with all the challenges and concerns we have around climate change. And then we're going to be, in December, we're going to be talking about LEED v 4.1 and product optimization, how to make products more sustainable. So any of you that are on the call today that are, working in buildings, if you're looking to do LEED certification, or you're really interested in going well beyond just saving energy and you want to think about minimizing the embodied carbon within the products in your buildings or your operations, these webinars we're doing on September 18th and December 10th would be really great to attend. So this has been recorded. We actually have, we had a large number of people register for this, and I see we've got a good number of them on today. But for those of people that didn't get to join, we're going to be sending the recording. Fine parts. You want to make sure the foot candles are right, the spacing is right. It drives me crazy when I go into plants and they're like, "Oh yeah, we just did an LED retrofit." Oh, great. So you changed your light bulbs from your standard, uh, metal halide to just lamps, or you went from, T5